It is so good to be back with you guys again this morning. My family and I have been traveling for the last few weeks and getting to spend some family vacation time together. So I'm sure you've done a little bit this summer as well. And then also getting a chance to take kind of a spiritual retreat and study and just reflect on what God wants to say and what he wants to do over this next year here at our church. But it is so good to be back. Even this morning, I just walked in and just even as we just began to worship, I was like, man, I've missed this. I've missed my frontline peeps. And so it is just so good to be back together, just worshiping again. And it's good to be wrapping up this series that we've been working through called Against the Grain. As Brad just said a moment ago, we've been looking at the life of Daniel. In fact, we were looking at the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. And so today we're looking at Daniel chapter 6, and we're wrapping up this series talking about what it means to live a life against the grain. And so today, Daniel is our hero, and we're going to look at one of the most famous stories in the Bible, actually, of Daniel and the lion's den. Some of you, if you grew up in church, you've gotten flashbacks right now of like flannel graph and, lions and all this kind of stuff that you had to color and draw. But we're going to look at this very famous story in the Bible. And so the question that Daniel finds himself facing as we enter into this story is the question, am I willing to risk being different? That's what Daniel's up against. That's the question that he's facing. Am I willing to risk being different than everybody else around me? And so the question I want you to think about, and even all those of you on Facebook, hello, it's great that you're joining us. I want you to think about this as well as we enter into this story this morning. And the question is this: would anybody know that I'm different just by the way I live my life? Would anybody know in my relational world, in my career, on the soccer field, in my job, whatever it is, at school, would anyone know that I'm different? And if you're a follower of Jesus today, would anybody know that I'm a Christian? Would anybody know that I'm a follower of Christ just by observing the way I live my life? That's the question. So I want to take you to a time when the world's greatest superpower has just come under new management, under new leadership. And so if you were here last week, David talked about the fact that at the end of chapter 5, a new king is on the scenes. Belteshazzar is out. His kingdom is done. And so now there's a new king. And of course, the king I'm talking about is King Darius the Mede from Daniel chapter 5 and Daniel chapter 6. And what we're going to see is that Daniel, who is a Jewish exile, is what he is. He rises to a position of prominence and influence in this new king's administration, just like he has with all these other kings that have come and gone. And so Daniel is rising. He's in power, and Darius the Mede is the new king on the scene. So we're going to jump in. This is Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 3. It says this: Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. Okay, so what these other administrators and officials are doing is they're looking for a chance to take Daniel down. They're jealous, they're upset that he's gotten so much influence already, so they're looking for a way to take him down. Now, if you've been tracking with us over the last month, the book of Daniel in the Bible is basically a story about how God's people can survive and even thrive in the midst of an exile. The question of Daniel is, how do God's people maintain their Jewish identity as the people of God, even when everything else in society around them wants to snuff it out and get rid of it? Daniel, in a sense, is a manual for how to survive an exile. What does that mean? What's an exile? That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. Just so we clarify and so we understand what we're talking about, God's people are in exile in the land of Babylon during this time in the story. Exile is not captivity. It is relocation. It's really important you understand that and you make that distinction. Exile is not captivity. It's relocation. They're not captives or slaves like they were earlier in the story. If you remember the book of Exodus, earlier in the story, they're slaves in Egypt. They're in captivity. They have no rights. They have no citizenship. They are essentially property. They're owned by someone else. That is not the case in exile. What's happened in exile is they've been relocated. So they've been plucked, they've been stripped from their land, they've lost Jerusalem, they've lost the temple, they've lost the promised land, and now they are in this new land, the land of Babylon. That's where they are. But they have rights. Think of them almost like second-class citizens. Like they're almost like refugees or something. Like they can hold jobs, they can have positions of influence, they can own their own house. In fact, that's how Daniel has managed to rise to all these positions of influence within each one of these kings' administration. It's not captivity, it's relocation. Because of that, the greatest threat for God's people in exile is not persecution, it is assimilation. The greatest threat for God's people in exile is not persecution, it is assimilation. Assimilation means you just begin to look like everybody else around you. There's no distinguishment anymore between you and everybody else. In fact, that was the goal of exile. In fact, the word assimilation comes from the Assyrians, who were kind of made the practice famous, but the Assyrians did it, the Babylonians and the Persians and Medes did it, where they would go in and they would conquer a group of people, and then they would strip them from their homeland. They would bring them to their society and their culture, and they would basically just make them one of the boys, one of the girls. Like you would just fit in. So there was no distinguishment anymore, and you were just like everybody else. That was the whole goal of exile, was to assimilate you. And in this story we're going to look at here with Daniel today, persecution happens. Persecution happens to Daniel, but it happens because he refuses to assimilate. He refuses to be just like everyone else. And that's why he's persecuted. The greatest threat for God's people is not persecution, it's assimilation. Well, Brian, what does a manual about how to survive in exile have to do with me and my life today? Great question. I'm really glad you asked it. Here's all I'm saying. There is something breaking down in the church community today. Statistics tell us that Christians and people who go to church live basically no better quality of life than everybody else. The divorce rate is just as high in the church as it is outside the church. People fall in character just as often. People mismanage their money inside the church just the same as they do outside the church. They don't claim to have any more of a sense of peace in their lives. And so really, if you think about it, the greatest threat, I believe, to the church, God's people, to the church in America today is not persecution, it's assimilation. That we just begin to look like everybody else. There's no distinguishment anymore between God's people and everyone else. When people walk around and say, oh, eventually here in America, us Christians, we're going to get persecuted. No, we're not. You have to actually be different in order to get persecuted. You know what I mean? Like if you're just like everybody else, if you're just fit in, just like nobody's going to persecute you. We are a ways away from being in threat of persecution in this country as Christians because we haven't refused to assimilate yet. We just look like everybody else. That's the greatest threat, I believe, for the church today is assimilation, that we just sort of fit in and go along with everything else. And yet, when you think about what the New Testament calls the church to be, if you look at how the New Testament writers talked about Christians and talked about the church, Paul says in Romans 12, you should no longer conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but you should be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks about the church, and he says, basically, think of yourselves as temporary residents or foreigners. Think of yourself almost as like refugees. You're passing through this world. But this world is not your home. You were made for somewhere else, for another world. That's how we're supposed to think of ourselves. It's just passing through, temporary residents and foreigners. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul talks to a group of what would have been primarily Roman citizens who were retired military folks, and he says, your citizenship is first and foremost in the kingdom of heaven. In other words, you're not first and foremost a Roman citizen or an American citizen or whatever. You are first and foremost a citizen of the kingdom of God. And because of that, that makes you different. It makes you distinct. You're not supposed to fit in with the categories that the world wants to put you into. Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. We're not supposed to fit into those categories. We're supposed to be a third way, a distinct people, a group of people whose citizenship are first and foremost in the kingdom of heaven, and therefore we don't perfectly fit in to any of those categories of the rest of the world. That's how the New Testament writers described the church. So I would say this, if you're looking for something to write down or something to kind of take away, this is the main idea from this sermon. It's this idea that God does not want to rescue us from being different. He wants to rescue us from being the same. You were not made to fit in. You were made to stand out. You were made to be different. That's what God's called the church to. In this story with Daniel, you're going to see God does not want to rescue Daniel from being different. He wants to rescue Daniel from being the same and fitting in just like everybody else. So we're going to jump into that. And so go forward a little bit. The administrators are looking for a way to take Daniel down. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, "Long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked." So King Darius signed the law. I mean, if you're a narcissist, it's like, this is awesome. I think it would be great for people to worship me for the next 30 days. Sounds good. So he signs the law. Now, what's happened here in this moment is that Daniel's enemies are using this established practice of Persian and Mede law, where basically the king could, when a law was signed by the king, he was signing away his own veto power. So they sort of entrap Daniel and outmaneuver the king in this moment, because essentially the king, even though he wants to save Daniel, he doesn't want Daniel to be sent to this den of lions, but by signing this law, he signed away his own veto power, and he can't get out of it. He can't rescue Daniel himself anymore from his own fate. So what's happening here is essentially there's this collision of politics and religion. These are laws about prayer. They're laws about who you can and cannot pray to. And so I'll go on from there. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and he got on Facebook and he told the whole world his opinion of what he thinks the government should or should not be doing. Yeah. No, that's not what he does. One of the interesting things about Daniel chapter 6 is Daniel actually doesn't speak. He doesn't say anything until the very end of the story, when he's just giving testimony to what God did for him. It's the only time he talks. He doesn't protest. He doesn't tell the government what they should or shouldn't be thinking or doing. He doesn't do any of that. What does he do? When he learned that the law had been signed, he went home and he knelt down as usual. So this was his normal practice. In his upstairs room, he kneels down with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Now, what Daniel's doing here, you have to understand, was a practice of the Jewish people who were faithful to God during the exile at this time. So what they would do is 3 times a day, they would open the windows of their house toward the east, toward Jerusalem, because it was a way for them, as they prayed and gave thanks to God, it was a way for them to connect with their story, with their Jewish identity, and with their history of being this unique, different people of God. And so that's what he's doing. He's kneeling down and he's praying to the east. And so this would have been really, really distinct. This would have been easy to spot because it would have made Daniel weird. In fact, I would say if there's a great bumper sticker for what Christianity, for what the people of God are supposed to be, if you make bumper stickers, I would highly recommend you go make this one. Keep Christianity weird. Wouldn't that be a great bumper sticker? Almost like the Keep Portland weird, if you've ever seen those bumper stickers. That's kind of the idea. Keep Christianity weird. What Daniel's doing here is weird. It would have made him stand out because it was his religion, the way he followed God, would have been the thing that made him distinct. So then the officials went together to Daniel's house, and they found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? They've got him. They've got King Darius. For the next several verses, what happens is King Darius tries to maneuver, tries to get out of it. He tries to find some way around, but he can't ultimately. And so the next part, go ahead. Verse 16, so at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and to be thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, "May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and could not sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, "Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you served so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered. This is the only time he talks. Daniel speaks in the entire chapter. "Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you either, your majesty." So it's not I'm for you or I'm against you exactly. I'm just faithful to God first and foremost, and God saw that, and he rescued me, and I have not wronged you. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. So you have this beautiful moment, right? Where Daniel is rescued. In fact, this is the part where we all applaud, okay? Go ahead and applaud. This is the point. Yay, yes. Oh, isn't this wonderful? He was rescued from the mouth of the lions. And if you're in children's church, this is where we end the story. Except the problem is that's not actually where the story of Daniel in the lion's den ends. Wouldn't it be great if that's just where the chapter ended? But it's not. In fact, to be honest with you, I had totally forgotten how the story of Daniel in the lion's den ends until I was preparing for this sermon, and I kind of went back to the story, and it was like, oh, that's right. There's this whole other part. And like most stories in the Bible that we've forgotten how they ended, Daniel in the lion's den has a very gruesome ending to it. It goes like this. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and their children. Wait, hold on, wait a minute. With their wives and what did their wives and their children do? They didn't do anything. They weren't part of this, right? And by the way, what are they being thrown into the lion's den for? For maliciously accusing Daniel? Wait a minute. All they were doing, they were just enforcing a law that was already there, weren't they? I mean, the king was the one who signed the law. They just enforced it. And yet at the end here, he throws them into the lion's den along with their wives and their children. And what happens? The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. They're killed instantly. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you, which is a great thing to say right after you threw a bunch of innocent people into a den of lions. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And that's the way the story of Daniel in the lion's den ends. It ends, even though the king makes this wonderful decree, even though he acknowledges God at the end. He acknowledges that God's the one who rescued Daniel, and he even acknowledges his kingdom's going to go on forever. In other words, his kingdom's a bigger deal than my kingdom even though he says all that. It's not like justice is done at the end of this story, right? That's not really the point of the story, that justice is done, or that the society was transformed, or the system was changed. And now King Darius has now become a Christian king, and the nation of Persia has become a Christian nation. That's not even the point of the story. To make that the point of the story, like some people have done, is to completely miss the point of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. To completely misinterpret it. Transformation of the society and of the system was not the point. Persia is just as bloodthirsty. King Darius is still a brutal narcissist who wants to punish anybody who stands up against him. The system is still unjust. The point of the story of Daniel is that God has the power to rescue people who put their trust in him and who are not afraid to be different, even in the midst of an unjust system. The point is that God has the power to rescue people from any unjust system we find ourselves in if we're willing to be different, if we're willing to stand apart, if we're willing to trust him enough to actually be different. You see it all throughout the Bible. God rescues people out of unjust systems. He hears the cry of the oppressed wherever they are. Begins all the way early in the book of Genesis, from the first real crime that happens right after Cain kills Abel, these two brothers. It says that the blood of Abel cried out from the ground to God, and God hears the cry of Abel's blood essentially crying out, this unjust thing that's happened. Later on in the book of Exodus, Moses is standing, and God is talking to Moses through a burning bush. And God says, Moses, I'm sending you to Egypt because I have heard the cry of my people who are oppressed. He doesn't say, Moses, I'm sending you there to go fix Egypt and to go rescue the system and create a different system in Egypt so people live a little bit better there. That's not what he sends. He says, I'm sending you to rescue my people because I've heard the cry of my people. God doesn't always change the system. Sometimes the system has to die because it doesn't work. It's made from man. God does rescue people all throughout the Bible from the beginning to the end. He calls us to be set apart. He calls us to be different, and he rescues people who are not afraid to be different. So here's the point of the story. What are we supposed to do with this? Okay, I hear this story. What am I supposed to do with it Monday through Saturday? How am I supposed to live it out in my life? Here's what I would say. The best way to make a difference in this world is to be different. The best way to make a difference in this world is to actually be different in the way you live your life, in the way that you refuse to kind of be compartmentalized into the things that the world and the media wants to compartmentalize you into the categories it wants us to fit into, to be a third way, to be a group of people who say, I trust first and foremost in God, and that means I'm going to be a little bit weird. There are moments where I'm just going to seem weird. So the question is, how has God called you to be different? How is God calling you to stand out, to be different in the things that you value, in the way that you live your life? Would anybody know that you're different just by the way that you live your life? How is God calling you to find that third way, that distinct way as the people of God in your life? I'll close with this. On July 10th, a few weeks ago, this month, the last of these 12 boys and their assistant soccer coach were rescued from the mouth of a cave in Thailand. Did any of you guys follow this story? Anybody else? Yeah, I was riveted to the story. If you don't know it, the whole world tuned in as the last of these boys were rescued. What happened is on June 23rd, these 12 soccer players, these young men, went into this cave in Thailand with their assistant coach, and they were just going in to explore and have a good time. But what happened is flash flood waters rose quickly, and they got trapped inside this cave. So where they were actually up kind of like on a ledge inside this cave, running out of air and running out of time. And so eventually somebody figured out that's where they were. And so then this monumental rescue effort went underway to rescue these boys. And the whole world, it was just like a global thing. Everybody from all these different nations were tuning in and watching and rooting for these boys to be rescued. At one point, it looked like they were all going to die. It looked like it wasn't going to work, and they were going to run out of time. In fact, a Thai Navy SEAL gave his life. He died in the rescue effort trying to rescue these young boys. But eventually, on July 10th, the last of these boys were rescued, and they came out of the cave. This picture that you're seeing right now was taken actually like a little bit over a week ago after they'd had some time to recover from their whole ordeal. There was like this press conference with them. Go ahead to the next picture, if you will. This young man right here, as he began to began talking, he was saying thank you. He was thanking this family of this Thai Navy SEAL. He was just showing gratitude for this man who gave his life in the rescue effort for them. And in the midst of it, he just broke down weeping, and he couldn't even finish. This kid right here will never be the same again. He will forever be different. The kid who came out of that cave on July 10th is a completely different human being than the kid who went into the cave on June 23rd. That kid is gone forever. And he will always be a little bit different. He'll always be a little bit weird because he will forever, for the rest of his life, be marked by the rescue effort it took to save him, to save his life. We love a great rescue story, don't we? It's why the whole world tunes in for these kinds of things, because we love great rescue stories. It's hardwired into our being. At the cellular level, we just love it. Daniel in the lion's den is a great rescue story. For those of us in this room who know Christ, who put our faith and our trust in him, whether you realize it or not, being a part of a church means you're part of this rescue story as well. The gospel is the fact that Jesus gave his life in a monumental rescue effort for us. We couldn't rescue ourselves. We were in a situation we'd gotten ourselves into. We couldn't save ourselves. And Jesus gave his life and rescued us and redeemed us and pulled us back from certain death. And because of that, we will never, ever be the same. We will forever be different. We will forever be just a little bit weird because we've experienced something. We've encountered something, and it's left us changed forever. So when we foster and adopt kids who have been tossed away and thrown away by the system that we live in our world today, people look at us and they say, that's weird. Why would you do that? When my wife and I were foster parents for a year, that people literally said to us, you have 4 kids and you can barely take care of them. What are you doing? That's just weird. And we had to say, yeah, it is. You're right. It's weird. When we take our hard-earned vacation money and our hard-earned vacation time and we go to places like Haiti or Ethiopia, it's weird. It just is. It's weird. Why would you do that? When we go down on a perfectly sunny summer day in West Michigan and spend an afternoon in Hartside Park, it's weird. People literally like, why didn't you go to the beach? Why didn't you go somewhere else? It's just weird. It is. My invitation to you is, would you come be weird with us? Weird people have the most fun, I'm here to tell you. Would you come be different? Would you come be distinct with us? That's what we're called to be. No longer conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. Be somebody different because of what happened, the rescue effort it took. You are a temporary resident. You're a foreigner just passing through this land. This world is not your home. Your citizenship is first and foremost in the kingdom of heaven, and therefore you will never perfectly fit into the different categories the world wants you to fit into. Be weird and be proud of it. God didn't call you to fit in. He called you to stand out. And what he called us to say in our weirdness and in our differentness is to give testimony, just like Daniel did in the story, that God has the power to shut the mouths of the lions in our world to devour. God has the power to rescue us from whatever unjust system we find ourselves in, from whatever situation we find ourselves in. God has the power to rescue people when we trust in him and are not afraid to live his way and be different. That's what he calls us to. So here's what I want to do. I'd love if we could just to stand in this room, and I would love to offer a prayer, and then we're going to sing a song to close.